Okay, so here, this is my MongoDB container and it is exposing the port, like my MongoDB pod is exposing like 27017 port. So, and I created a cluster IP service and then I'm just saying like, so expose this port 8081 and the target port should be like 27017. Okay. So how does it actually identify like, so target port in the sense like any ports that matches this particular label, like this particular label, like app MongoDB. So this is my app MongoDB, right? My pod. So any pod that matches this particular label, like app MongoDB. So if it is exposing like 27017, so then I'll be able to connect to this particular pod's port like 27017 via this 8081. Okay. So it is something like, so this is my service, right? 8081. So my service is exposing port 8081. Okay. So ideally, like, and just keep in mind, like, so we are not exposing this traffic to outside world. Like, so this is just inside this Kubernetes cluster. Like, so this is the cluster IP, which is the default one. Okay. So cluster IP in the cluster IP service. So it actually gets created, like it doesn't expose your, it is not something like which exposes your network to the outside world. Okay. So in this case, like since this MongoDB pod and then MongoDB Express pod, they are in the same cluster, right? So since they're in the same cluster, like if my MongoDB pod, if it wants to communicate with this MongoDB, okay, so it will call this service. Like, so if you remember, like my MongoDB Express, I'm passing this MongoDB URL as, so MongoDB URL. So I'm passing this as MongoDB service. Okay. So which is nothing but like this is the service like MongoDB service, right? Okay. So I'm passing this MongoDB URL and internally this MongoDB Express. So it actually calls this particular. So I need to pass this host name like, okay, since I changed this particular port number from 27017 to 8081. So I also need to pass the port number over here. Okay. Or else like you'll get an issue. So how do you pass this port number? Like, so if we see, go. So this is how like we override the port number. Okay. So I also previously like I was actually using the same port like target port and then this port, right? So that is the reason why like I didn't actually pass this particular port like, okay, so I was just passing this URL like host name as like MongoDB service. But now I changed my host name, right? So I'm supposed to make changes to my, I also need to pass this particular host name. Okay, for that, like what I can do, like name. So value. So what is my new port? So it is like 8081. So this is the new port, like which I used to set. Okay, so I'm just overwriting this. Okay, so I'm just overwriting. So in this case, like what is happening? So my MongoDB Express, so it is calling this service like MongoDB service with port number 8081. Okay, and what happens like behind the scenes, like any traffic that it receives, like this MongoDB service, so which it receives on the port 8081, so it forwards that particular traffic to actual container, like actual pod that is matching this label app MongoDB. So which one is actually matching this label? Like MongoDB pod is matching that label, right? And it is also exposing like 27017, the target port. So the traffic from Mongo Express will be routed to MongoDB service on port 8081, which is again transferred to MongoDB pod on 27017. Okay, so is it clear?
Yes, Anna.
So now let me show you. Uh, okay, so still they're getting initialized. So let me browse this. Okay, so you can actually see I'm able to access this. So they're in the running state, these pods. Okay, so ideally, like what we are actually doing. So this is the service. So I'm actually creating another service. So this is my architecture over here. Like okay, so uh, this is MongoDB service. This is my MongoDB service. Okay. And the same way, like I have another service which is actually created for MongoDB Express. Like, and the name of that service is. So this is my MongoDB Express service, like which I created. So this is like of type notepad. We'll see what it is actually. But internally, like it is actually pointing like 8081 port, any traffic to 8081 port. So it is getting target reset to this 8081 port. And this is the selector like Mongo Express. Okay, so even this is getting exposed on 8081 port. Okay, so you can actually see unintentionally, like we created like two services with the same port number. Okay, so if you see Ctl Get Services. Okay, so even this service, like it is actually running on 8081, and even this service is actually running on 8081. So ideally, like we are actually calling this service on 8081 and even this service on 8081. So that is the thing. Like, so we need to observe, like, so ideally, like we cannot expose like multiple, I mean, so same port numbers on multiple items, right? Multiple websites or something like that. But in Kubernetes, like each service is just like a separate entity kind of thing. Like, so that is the reason why like, we're able to expose this service with 8081 and even this with 8081. Okay. So initially, and from external, I'm just calling this particular Mongo Express, and this Mongo Express is internally like it is actually calling this particular service. Okay, so for any MongoDB operation, so this is again invoking this MongoDB Express. Okay, and again like from this like we are actually this is actually this services point routing the traffic to MongoDB. Okay, any questions here?
So the MongoDB service is the intermediary service for the connection to the MongoDB, and Mongo Express is just for the outside, exposing it to the outside.
Ideally, yes, please. So basically, like for the communication between this MongoDB, this pod. So ideally in Kubernetes, like any communication between the pods, so it should happen via services. Okay, so that is the thing like which you should remember. Like just like networking in Kubernetes in Docker, like services actually create network between multiple pods. Okay. So for communication between this MongoDB Express and then MongoDB, so we actually call this particular, so this is a node application, right? MongoDB Express. So this node application, so it is actually talking to this MongoDB container, right? So what is happening? So this Mongo Express, so it is actually communicating to this particular MongoDB pod via this service, like MongoDB service. Okay. And this service, like how it is actually configured. So it is configured in such a way that it exposes the port 8081. Okay, it exposes this port 8081, and any traffic to this 8081, like we instructed it to route that particular traffic to this MongoDB. Okay, so 27017. So this is how like we are actually doing like so port 8081 on the service. So it is actually in the target port, like the traffic is sent to this target port 27017. So which pod like it is actually transferring. So that will be decided based on this label. Okay. So any questions or you want me to repeat this? So this is clear, right?
Yes.
So this is with the cluster IP. So just forget about this node port, like which we mentioned, like I'll talk about it in shortly. Like, so this is the basic thing, like the cluster IP. Okay. So cluster IP service, like you cannot access this cluster IP service from outside world. Okay. So directly there is a tweak, but you cannot like actually, so this is not something like which is exposed to the external world directly. Okay. So that is what like we are supposed to keep in mind. So it is used for communication between pods that are in the cluster like Kubernetes cluster. Okay, so this is all about like MongoDB. I mean, so how this networking is actually done and then how we are actually connecting this Mongo Express and then MongoDB pods. Okay, so secrets replica set, we saw all these things like, okay. So any questions? So before actually going to other topic like services. So important concepts under services are services. So one is like, so these are the different types of services that are actually supported. Like one, cluster IP, two, node port, three, load balancer. Okay. And we have something called as external. So external IP. Okay. So this is something called, there is something called as like external IP. Okay. So these are the important concepts under services like cluster IP, node port, load balancer, and then external IP. Apart from this, like we have something called as like ingress. Okay. So ingress is something again like we'll also see is ingress, but these are the main important concepts around like networking. Okay. So till now, like we saw the cluster IP concept. Like so, ideally, like in my MongoDB. So I'm actually using this cluster IP. So since I don't want to expose this MongoDB directly, and in any interaction with MongoDB, I wanted to do that with my MongoDB Express application. Okay. So my MongoDB Express, so it is actually talking to this MongoDB via this cluster IP service. Okay. Just Okay, so let's actually look at this cluster IP in detail. Like, so we saw this cluster IP. So ideally, like the cluster IP is something like which is actually used for communication between the pods, and the communication is only limited to this cluster only, like Kubernetes cluster. So you cannot actually access any external and any the cluster IP service from outside world. Okay? So that is clear. Let's actually see a example. Like, so I just wanted to show you like how we can actually make use of this cluster IP. Okay. So for that, like what I'll actually do is like I'll create a so I'll take something called as like HTTP server. Okay, a different kind of HTTP server. So I'm just copy pasting this thing. Okay, so my deployment is something like apps v1 deployment, and I wanted to name it as like HTTP server, the name, and then the label like I would like to give like HTTP server. Okay, so I would like to create like 5 replicas, and then the template like so. Ideally, like this is my HTTP server, and this label should actually match with this particular label. Okay. Let's remove all these env values. So I would like to use a separate container, so a separate image. So it is called as something like this. So it is. So this is the image like HTTP TPS. Yeah, so I wanted to make use of this particular Docker hub, okay, a Docker repository. So before actually going into this particular Kubernetes and all this stuff, like so, I just wanted to show you what is the purpose of this particular this service, like this particular container. Okay, so ideally, like what I'll do is. And I'll show you a command like so to delete like all the content like so you see like I created like MongoDB cluster container and all this stuff, right? So if I wanted to delete like I just wanted to clean up all these containers and all these pods. So what I can actually do is Ctl delete all hyphen all. Okay, so this will delete all the pods in the current namespace. Okay, so let's run this container. This is a Docker image. So you can actually see what is the purpose of this particular Docker image, like why I'm actually using this particular image. So this Docker image it will echo all the HTTP request properties back to the client. So any request like that we make to this particular HTTP server. So what this container is actually doing is like, so it is actually giving that information back to us. Okay. So I'll run this particular thing. So this is my run. And this is just a Docker command to run this container. Hope you didn't forget this. Okay, so now we can actually see this container is actually running, and then it is running on ports 8080, 8080 and 8443. Let me run this thing. Host 080. So this is the output of this particular container. Okay, so it is exposing, it is giving all the request headers and then request headers back to us. Okay, so you can see like, so I just made a get request to this particular server, like it is giving me all that information. And you can also see the host name. This is something like the host name. Okay, so if you see talk up, yes. So this is my host name, like this is my container ID, right? AFE7137, like a container. My request is actually getting sent to this particular container, and this is the container's host name, like, okay. So even that is getting displayed. So I can use Nginx server for my demo purpose, but Nginx you cannot actually display the host name, right? So that's why like I did a quick Google to find out this particular image, so which is actually outputting the host name also, like, okay. So I just wanted to show you the load balancing capabilities and all that stuff. So you can actually see, so this is the main purpose of this particular Docker container. So I'll be using this image. Kubectl all. Just remember, like, so this delete all only deletes only Kubernetes related clusters and then pods. Okay, so it doesn't actually create like the pod that was actually that I ran using the Docker command. Okay. Okay, so everything is clear. So I just wanted to make sure, like, so the ports that are getting exposed by this particular container, by this container is 8080. We are also exposing 8443. Yeah, 8443. Okay, so this is my deployment file. So I'm actually creating 5 replicas of this particular image. Okay. So now I wanted to show you my service, like cluster IP service. Like, let's see the cluster IP service initially. So initially the name of the service, like kind API version and then metadata, I just wanted to name it as like HTTP server underscore service selector. Like, so to which container, to which port, like I want to apply this particular service. So I want to apply this port, this service to this HTTP pod, HTTP server port. So type I would like to go with like HTTP server, and this is the one, like I just. So what is my target port? Like, so I wanted to expose port 8080 on 8080. So same port I'll be using. And also, so I also wanted to expose, I just wanted to name it as like HTTP. Okay. So I also want to expose my port like. So this is my HTTPS port. So this is running on 8443. Okay. So this is my deployment. And then this is the service. Like any questions over here? Kubectl apply -f. And then so deployments, deployment for HTTP server. Okay, so the deployment is successful. Kubectl Get Services. So this is a service like which is actually created like so it is created of type like cluster IP, and you can see like so it is exposing 8080 port and then 8443 port. So there is no external IP. So that is the default behavior with cluster IP. Okay. So this is the one like if you want if there is any other pod like which wants to communicate with this particular server, so it can use this particular it can use this URL like as a HTTP service hyphen colon and which port like we wanted to use like we want to use 8080 for any internal service can actually access this particular pod like via this URL like HTTP column 8080. Okay. So this URL is accessible only from other pods which are in the cluster. Okay. Not from external one. Okay. So that you should actually remember. But there is a way. So to access this particular cluster, like so cluster IP service from outside world, like so in order to access that from outside world, so we have something called as like proxy. So there is something called as Kubernetes proxy. So what we need to do is like, so initially you need to start this proxy. Okay. So this is just used for debugging purposes and just for quickly verifying the data. So you're not supposed to start this proxy on the production server and then expose your services to outside world. Like that is not the intention of this particular proxy and then the cluster IP. So the cluster IP is only intended for internal communication between pods. Okay. But for quickly testing this thing, like so from outside world, like what you can actually do is, so you can actually start this proxy, Ctl proxy hyphen port. So you can actually give any port. I'll give 8089. Okay, so my proxy, like kubectl proxy, got started on this port 8081, 8089. So this is actually started on 8089, right? So there is a way to access this particular proxies via, so there is something called, like there is a command, kubectl access. So accessing any services like running on the clusters. Okay, so basically like what you can actually do. So you can construct this proxy API URL, something like this. So this is my Kubernetes master address. So since I'm actually using Docker desktop, so ideally like my Kubernetes master address would be like localhost. Okay. So this is the one like the proxy on which like we are getting exposed. Like so this is my Kubernetes proxy. Okay, so I'll copy this. Okay, so now I'll frame this URL. So my proxy URL would be something like this 127.0. Okay, so API v1 namespace name. So I'm using like default namespace in Kubernetes. So I'll introduce these namespaces in further sessions. Like, so for now, like we are actually using this default namespace. Okay, so the namespace name is default namespace services. And you can just ignore this HTTP or HTTPS. By default, I'm actually using this HTTP, the service name. So what is my service name? So this is my service name, HTTP server hyphen service. And what is a port name? So if I wanted to expose, like call this 808 port, so this is the port name which I gave, right? So HTTP. So I need to specify this port name over here, like HTTP proxy. Okay, so this is how like we actually call this. So you can actually see, so this is the output, like it is almost same, right? Localhost 8080. And you can actually see this is the host name, like Kubernetes.docker internal. So this is the internal host name that is being used. Uh, so user agent, like I'm just calling it from Chrome. You can also see this, like one of the differences. I see there is a cookie over here, but here like we don't have this cookie. And you can actually see, so if you see this part, like host name part, it is actually load balanced. Okay. So now it is BPPMB. So now it is like ZWZPQ Q71HD. Okay. So it is continuously changing. If you see, and these are the host names like which we have, like if you see Ctl Get Ports. So you can see like BPPMB. So Q71HD, like Q71HD, like this is the host name. So each and every time, like the request is actually going to one of these nodes. Okay. So this is how like you can actually expose a service, like so to the outside world, like you need to run this Kubernetes proxy. Okay. So once you run this Kubernetes proxy, like you can actually so start this. Okay. So you can actually access this via this framed URL. So how the traffic is actually routing? So it is actually, so we are specifying like use this service. So when I'm saying like use this service, so it is the traffic is from external internet, like it is going to this service, okay, via this proxy. And then, so I'm just specifying use this port, like, so I'm just specifying use this port like HTTP. Okay. So once I know this port, so I obviously like I'll get to know like what is the target port, like any traffic like which is actually coming to this port. So it is actually routed to the pod like with this label and this target port. Okay. So the pod with this label is HTTP server. So it is getting routed to this HTTP server. So you can actually use any URL, like, so this is like default URL, like this is the base URL. And after this, like you can actually see, so this is the base URL, like path, right? So after this, like you can specify a.html. Okay. So it is just sending the request to a.html. This is the path. Okay. So any questions here? Um, so there are like other services like node port service and all this stuff, like so, but still, we are left with like 5 minutes only. Like, so do you want me to continue or so, or we can actually discuss if you have any questions or any doubt? So what do you say? Like, you wanted me to continue?
We'll take
So
more.
yeah, okay. Yeah. So this is, so till date, like we saw the cluster IP. Okay. So in the cluster IP, basically, like we are actually exposing, like the cluster IP is basically used for communication between internal communication between the pods. Okay, so we have a small tweak, like so by running this Kubernetes proxy, like we can actually expose, like we can call this particular cluster IP. So the traffic, like from outside world, like the traffic is actually coming to this proxy, and the proxy is actually taking care of calling this service. Okay. So that is what is happening behind the scenes in case of cluster IP. So we are not supposed to use this approach, like so run this kubectl proxy on the production servers and then expose these internal services to outside world. So there is a definitive purpose, right, for using these internal services. So you don't want to expose some of these services to external world or any of the some if your requirement is something like that, so you'll go with like cluster IP. Okay, so never ever use this kubectl proxy with the production services, like okay. So just for the purpose of debugging, like you can actually use this. Okay. So we'll see like other types of services like a node port service, load balancer service, and then external IP service. Like node port, I can actually show it to you on this local machine. So load balancer also, I can show it to you on this local machine. But if we can actually show this on so AWS or GCP or Azure, so it will be more clear. Like so, because like behind the scenes, like so these cloud providers they'll create like a load balancer for you, and then all that stuff happens. But on local host, like it is again internally it makes use of this node port only. Okay, so we'll see what these services are: node port and then load balancer, external IP, and ingress tomorrow. Okay, thank you guys then.
I just have one question. So
Mhm.
I was trying to use the existing Docker images in my local machine, but
Mhm.
but I'm facing like image pullback of error.
So existing Docker image in the sense like so the image already exists on your machine. Okay, so for that like you need to specify like so basically like pull there is some command like so pull auto pull or something like I'll show it to you. Okay, one second. So there is a small thing like so which you need to do.
So ideally, when we are mentioning this image names, like from where is it trying to pull that image
So
from?
it ideally pulls these images from any cloud repository, like public cloud repositories like Docker Hub. So Kubernetes also tries to fetch some of these images from Google K8's repo, I believe. Like so, there is some open K8 repo. So you can also configure like so configure to use like AWS or your private repositories over here. Like okay, so even that is actually possible, but that needs to be configured. Like so in the console, like you need to configure it. Okay, so you can actually specify this particular attribute like image pull policy never. So if you just specify this like next to this image, like it actually tries to fetch the image, your local image. Okay, so you can try with that.
Yeah, I'm right.
So image pull policy should be like never. So various options for this thing. You can quickly look at the documentation. So if not present, the image is pulled only if it is not already present, like locally. Always, never the kubectl does not try fetching the image if the image is somehow already present locally, like the container. So yeah, so it doesn't actually fetch this image, like so it always tries to use this local image which was actually created. Okay. So the default value for this image pull policy is always like. Okay. Yeah. Thank you guys. And
Thank
any
you.
other questions? Okay. So if no questions, then we can actually drop off. Thank you guys. Thanks for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you.